Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. Today we're going to be doing another full-time portrait sketching walkthrough. I really enjoy doing these, and if you guys enjoy this one too, I do them a lot on my Patreon and I will leave the link to it in the description. Today we're drawing Amanda Seyfried, and I will also have the link to that reference photo in the description. So like with most of these, we're starting with a circle, and this circle is just the top of the head. This isn't the whole face, so we're gonna cut it in half, and that's gonna be where the eyeballs sit. And then we're gonna cut it in half again going down, and then this one extends further down, and that's gonna be the length of the actual face. So for this, there's a lot of me just eyeballing the reference photo. I want this to be more casual, and so I'm really just now shaping her face according to what I see in the reference photo. And then once I have that, I'm just gonna draw the initial shape of the nose starting from where the circle ends. And before we draw her mouth, we're gonna make sure that we have room for her chin before we go in with the corners of the mouth first. And then just drawing this very full shape for her lips for now. And these are all just placeholders. We're doing the same thing for her eyeballs. Just don't worry too much about the details at this point. Make sure you're using very light strokes. We're just making sure for now that every feature has its own place. We're gonna worry about it looking like the photo later on, but now is not the time for that. And then her eyebrows are just gonna be on top of those eyeballs. It may look like it's too close to the eyes at this point, but just remember that the actual shape of the eyes are much lower. This is just the full eyeball that's under the skin. And then now I'm just starting to draw in her hairline. I think that I've initially made her hairline too low, but again, at this point, it doesn't really matter as much. There's gonna be time to adjust that later. So her hair has a lot of volume, and so it just goes further out from her skull. And I'm using very loose pencil strokes, and I'm also just gonna really quickly draw in her shoulders and her arm before we go in and fill out the details of her features. So once we have everything down, we're now gonna go in with her nose, and I'm first drawing out a circle for the very tip of her nose, but I just need this as a point of reference to where the nose is facing. I think the nose, more than any other feature, would differ between people, so at this point it's the best time to keep checking your reference photo to try to see how you can get it to look like your reference photo. So then when we move on to the mouth, we can then use the width of her nose to figure out how wide her mouth needs to be. So I think it's always best when you're drawing lips to start from the corners, or at least just one in my case. And I'm just going to draw out the shadow that's cast by her lip instead of the whole bottom of her lip. I think that this gives it a nice softer look. So once the nose and mouth are established, I'm then using the bridge of her nose to just continue it on to the shape of her brow. I think initially I made her eyebrows too severe, but again, at this point it's easy to correct. For now, we just need a placeholder for those eyebrows. And then I'm just gonna really quickly go back to the side of her lip. I just think that it was too turned down. I just want to keep her mouth line more neutral to reflect the reference photo. So we can then move on to the hardest parts, which are her eyes. So starting from this one, and I always think it's easier to start from the corners like this and just try to still very carefully pay attention to the reference photo and how her eyes are draped across her eyeball. And then I'm not finishing that one eye before I move on to the other one. I'm drawing one part of the eye and then moving on to the other one just so I can level them out together before I finish the rest of the eye. So as you can see, even though these two aren't sloped in the same way, they are still at level with each other. So For this photo, I think that is what's most important. So once I've had the upper eyelids drawn in, I'm basically just doing the same thing to the lower ones. I'm checking the reference photo as I'm doing this, but then also doing the other eye before moving on to another area. And again, just making sure that they're both in line with each other. So for her, I'm then gonna draw out her upper eyelid still. And you can see while I'm doing this, I'm still using the circle underneath, still keeping that in mind when I draw out the eyelids and see how they're draped across that sphere that's underneath it. So then I am just very lightly drawing her eye bags. It's really to add overall shape to her eyes. But then after that, we're gonna go ahead and draw in her irises, which I think in this angle is probably the hardest parts to do. When I do this, I usually just keep track of how much white there is left in her eyes, but as you can see, she's really looking off to the side, and so I almost just preemptively drew in her pupils just so emphasize that she's looking off more to the side. Then I'm just gonna go very lightly over some of the shaded areas. When you're doing this, please make sure that you're keeping a light hand. You really don't want to use dark shadows this early on. And I also just opened up her nostril like right there more before going over to her lips and shading over the whole thing mostly. I'm just elongating her hairline a little bit. I think I made it too short for a while there, but once I fixed that, I am really roughly sort of clumping together the waves of her hair. Doesn't make sense too much right now, but I'm really just mapping out where it flows a little bit before I go over the whole thing when I shade them out. I did also darken up her nose a little bit, but I do think the ones for the bridge of her nose wasn't really necessary. I think I've accidentally made her nose too thin there. And then just darkening up her lips also. But once I've done that, I am now gonna go over her whole hair with my pencil on its side. It looks pretty dark because I am applying a lot of pressure to it, but I'm using the very blunt end of my pencil, so I still have room to add darker layers on top of this. It just looks dark right now because everything else isn't shaded in, but you guys will see later that we'll still be able to add more details on top of this. So I'm trying to follow the flow that I've mapped out before, but towards the end, I think I just went over the whole thing. But you can see it's still pretty light compared to how dark those initial shadows were. That is for her hair that's framing the left side of her face. The goal at this moment is really to just add some form of uniform value that separates her hair from the rest of the photo. And then we're just gonna slowly take that over to the shadow that's cast by her face on her neck. Make sure you're going dark to light still when you're doing this, and then doing the same thing to the clothes that she's wearing too. You can see I'm more rough with the shading on her clothes because I just want to fade out the details as it moves away from the center of her face. But then when I move back to shading her chest, I'm using a softer shade, and I'm just getting that by using lighter pressure on my paper, and also the pencil strokes right here are a lot closer together. And then I'm going to be using that same technique to bring that over to her face. And once again, make sure that you're going very light with the pressure on this. Really don't want to overdo it when you're shading their faces like this, might want to go darker maybe later on. Just build up the pressure similarly to how you would layer watercolors. And I'm also just lightly shading out her eyeball. I just want to add dimension to those very small areas too. And then once we go back to her hair and add darker layers to that too, be adding more and more pressure to my pencil. And I'm first focusing them on the darker parts of her hair, especially right here on her braid, because it does a good job in defining the shapes that they make. And then I will be applying the same amount of pressure onto the top of her head, and especially on her part right here. I erased the center of her part, but you could just go ahead and darken up the sides. I think it would have gotten a very similar effect that way. And then I'm softening up the shape of her eyebrow right here. And I'm being careful that I don't lose its shape completely. And then after that, we're just going to repeat the process for shading on her face, but now focusing on adding depth to the shading that we've put in before. So just adding this little dip to her upper lip right here. And then we can move on to adding more details to her eyes. So when we did the shading, we were using the blunt side of our pencil. Right now, it's okay to start going onto the sharper side of your pencil tip. And then the very first thing that I do is darken up. Exaggerate more is the color of her pupil. I'm just going ahead and softening up the arch of her eyebrow too. I'm seeing myself just darkening up again, just at the bridge of her nose. I think that was unnecessary. I think I've made her nose, especially right there, too thin, and I wouldn't do that if I hadn't had the advantage of hindsight. So that's what I did, and doing the same thing that I did to the left eye to the one on the right. I want to make sure that I'm just darkening up the parts of the eye that are supposed to be dark. We don't want to cover the whole thing and basically just line the whole thing. It's best to be strategic at this point, and really any point after this, especially when we're adding details to just the face. And then once we're done adding just those tiny darker details, I'm then going back to having my pencil on its side and carefully just adding more shadow to her face, focusing it on her cheeks. And since I'm focusing these right where her face is and it's supposed to be light, really just make sure you're being very careful while you're doing this. And I keep on saying it because it is key in sketches like these where you don't necessarily want it to look too realistic, but also you want to make it similar to the reference photo enough. Now what I'm doing is just adding one whole area right there where I want to add shadow to it. I just feel like it shapes up her head more and it looks more correct. And after that, I'm then just taking the sharper side of my pencil again and drawing in some of the strands that I need to. For me, the key when adding details to hair like this is to always start where the strands are the darkest. So right here on her braid, I'm going to start my pencil strokes from there and then fade it out. As you move away from that, chunk of dark area, and I will be taking that same principle and applying it to the rest of the hair. I'm just making sure that while I'm drawing out the strands, I'm still following the flow of the hair that I've mapped out initially. Other than that, this part is pretty relaxed for me. I actually think it's kind of fun. So after we fleshed out some of the hair a little bit more, I want to go back to her skin. Since I've added some more shading to her face, I want to do the same thing to her chest. And the same principle applies. Start with the darkest area first and then do a natural gradient. And I'm just adding some very loose details to her clothes. I really don't want this to look too detailed. I want to draw attention to her face more than anything. But yeah, I just still want to add structure to it, really, to make the whole thing make more sense. So then I am going back to her face again, and I'm just shaping out her lips more, and I'm using the same process, just keeping the pencil strokes light. So once that's done, I actually think that I made her left eye too far out, so I'm just gonna erase just the tip of it, just one side of it, and make those details lighter. Maybe move it very carefully to the right, but overall what I'm doing is taking out some of the darker details that made that eye just too wide. I think it makes more sense like this. So once that is done, I'm zooming you guys out so that you can see me blurring out some of the shading of her face with my fingertip. As usual, I don't recommend doing this if you're doing a finished sketch that you want to display later on. But the whole idea of this whole thing is to even it all out so that when we add our smallest details, those will stand out more. So before you do that, the first thing I did was sharpen up my pencil. I needed to be very sharp for these final details on her face. And I'm first focusing them on her eyes. I want those to attract the most attention, so mostly just her pupils. I want to add more detail to them, and I'm also just very quickly cleaning up the folds on her upper eyelids, and then going back to drawing her lashes. And throughout this whole thing, I am looking at my drawing and reassessing it next to the reference photo to try to see if there are things that I can add detail to, and also if there are highlights that I've shaded in by accident. And if there are, I'll just go back and erase some of that too. I'm also just shading in the sides of her eyeball to add more dimension to that one. I could have gotten away with doing the same thing to her left eye too, but I think I just forgot. And then I'm just going in on the hair. I want to emphasize this part because the part is where her hair is the darkest, so I want to add a lot more darkest to the sides. I'm also trying to bring back some of the strands that I needed. Most of them really just got lost after I've started filling in the value for her hair, so I want to go back and draw some of them back. I think more importantly is her braid. To get the kind of effect that I want, which is to make it look not too finished. I'm really just focusing on the darkest areas of the braid just to give a hint of what the shape is supposed to be, but I'm not too worried about drawing out all the strands of the braid. Just trying to make this whole sketch look finished but not really too realistic. And then I'm basically doing the same thing to her clothes. I want to add some of those darkest details in there very quickly, just to flesh out the shape of what she's wearing. And then finally, once I'm done with her clothes, I'm going back to her hair and just adding more volume to it. And then I'm doing the same thing to darken up some of the shadows of her face, and then I will be done. So that is it for this one. I intentionally left it not as finished as the other ones from this sketch, but I still really like it. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. So that is it for this one. Thank you guys for watching, and I will be seeing you guys again soon.